Well, we're here today with Dr. Paul Rimmer. Paul, thanks for being with us. If I understand this correctly, you aren't exactly looking for extraterrestrial life. Rather, you are studying the initial conditions that other planets would require in order for life to eventually arise there. Is that correct?
That's mostly correct, yeah. I'm very interested in finding out where life might be able to start, where it might not be able to start. I did get involved in one project looking at a biosignature on the planet closest to us, Venus. Um, but that might end up being, at best, a sort of counterexample, a good example of how you can have a biosignature without life.
Now, if there is this life form on Venus, just assume for a moment that there is. What are the odds that it's the next Andromeda strain? I need to
almost almost zero, actually. And there
I
are
need
good
to gauge
biological
my
reasons
existential
for that.
threat. Oh, really?
Yeah, no, it's if it's there, it's adapted to a very specific ecological niche, which would involve fairly large amounts of sulfuric acid, and it probably wouldn't be very happy with very large amounts of water, and it certainly wouldn't be well adapted to dealing with all of the different microbes and other things we have around. I think the real risk is if we brought it into our environment, we would kill it by accident, either through the conditions or just from the other life that happens to be there. Uh, it's fun to think about these science fiction things, and I suppose there's always a small chance something terrible will happen, but uh, the the chances from a biological standpoint are vanishingly small. So you can sleep well tonight.
Well, thank goodness. I really did need to gauge the existential threat of that the great Paul Rimmer, the Cambridge scientist, led us all to our doom overnight. It's good to know that only a tiny bit of a
I will
chance.
not be responsible for any sample return
Yeah.
missions from
Yeah.
Venus. Uh,
Seth, the greatest existential threat to you is not from other planets, but from life on this planet that tires of your weariness. So,
Well, on that cheery note, I have to ask, coming off of that though, how would life form? What are some of these ideas about how life gets started? Venus seems like a pretty different planet.
yeah, probably Venus, the way that it is now, would not be a great place to do prebiotic chemistry. Uh, Ironically, it might be a touch better for prebiotic chemistry than Earth, ironically. And that's because Earth has one of the worst molecules for doing prebiotic chemistry of all, and that's oxygen. Oxygen is an incredibly potent toxin for the majority of life, and that's because it reacts with things, and the way that it reacts with things is it tends to just break them apart. It's very, very bad for chemical complexity, and it's been the bane for many a prebiotic chemical experiment. But the Earth didn't always have a lot of oxygen, and around the time that life is thought to have started, there was almost no oxygen in Earth's atmosphere, and we know that with a very high level of confidence. So other things that you might need depend on the scenario in particular, but really what you need to do is you need to take something that's plausibly there already, and you need to end up building something that can make copies of itself reliably, but not too reliably. You do want it to make mistakes every now and again, um, so that it can be subject to the effects of Darwinian evolution, and so that it can start to diversify and become more, in that sense, like life as we know it. The way in which this is typically looked at is using the molecules that we know life uses, because it's very, very difficult to try this with molecules that life doesn't use, because we really don't know whether we're making any progress or not. So oftentimes the first step is to take these simple single carbon building blocks, figure out ways to react them to produce simple sugars, amino acids, nucleotides, the building blocks for DNA and RNA, the building blocks for proteins. The DNA and RNA hold the information. The proteins help to control the reactions that can copy and propagate that. And then you need something to contain the whole thing, which is, for life as we know it, phospholipids. And so ways to make those is really relevant too. And then the next step after you've made them is to figure out how the Lego pieces can come together to produce something functional. And so that's a pretty standard way in which, from a synthetic chemistry perspective, you would approach the problem of origins of life. And I think that that's the most promising avenue to take, because ultimately life is chemical. And so the origins of life is a chemical problem.
Now, that all sounds really, really complicated. Now, my initial thought is that sounds like a great argument for why life is quite rare in the universe, and maybe there's not that much life on Venus or Mars or extrasolar planets. Now, you're one of the world experts on this topic. What do you think? Is life going to
Oh boy.
be everywhere, or should we expect a pretty lonely universe?
Are they out there?
Yeah. Well, I will qualify myself as one of the world experts on the topic of whether there's life elsewhere in the universe, because I know about as much as anybody else, which is very little. I'm happy to be counted along with almost anybody else in terms of expertise on this, because we really have almost no empirical constraint. We know a little bit about prebiotic chemistry. So little has been explored. Chemistry is such a vast parameter space. You start to think about games like chess. Chess has a lot of possibilities. There's another game that people can look up, which I particularly like, called Go. It has vastly more possibilities than chess. So all the games of chess that could ever be played would only be a small fraction in terms of numbers of all the games of Go that could ever be played. And even that sort of combinatorics doesn't even come close to the sort of combinatorics that chemistry can have. The sort of chemicals that you can make in the chemical parameter space is vastly greater even than that space. If all the particles in the observable universe, all 10 to the 64-ish particles in the observable universe, were converted into processors, and all those processors were working in parallel to explore all of this chemistry, it would take longer than many times the age of the universe to even carve out a small fraction of that chemical parameter space. Now, we do have some guidance about that parameter space, so it's not entirely randomly walking, but it's very difficult to show that you've really explored what's important within that particular space. There are good reasons to think that origins of life is rare, in terms of it being, if you look at one small environment, even an environment that's very apt for doing this kind of chemistry, and you watch it for 100 years, it's unlikely that life will emerge after that 100 years. I would say that there are good reasons to believe that from the basics of the chemistry. But there are a lot of environments, and there's a lot of time. You might have as much as 1 billion years to have done this on the surface of Earth. And there are a lot of exoplanets. There are so many planets, probably so many rocky planets within their habitable zone. And so you're just running this experiment over and over and over. And so when you take a very small number, probability for life to originate in a single environment over a short amount of time, and you take that and multiply that by a very big number, and you don't have good constraints on either of those numbers, then you can get any number you want. So if you want there to be life everywhere, you can multiply a small number by a big number and get a big number. And if you want life to be unique, you can multiply those and get a number that's smaller than 1. And so we really don't have any good constraints. We need to find other examples, or if we see absolutely no other examples within the region where we're looking, that will at least give us some idea of how rare life really is. This is something we will know in the next 20, 30 years. We will actually have some good constraint one way or the other on how common or rare life is, depending on what we find.
Thanks. Something I kind of heard a lot of people, especially like Christian apologists, say is, once life is there, sure, you can have an explanation for how that grows and evolves to what we have today. But the jump from non-life to life is this qualitative chasm, and it is not just empirically something we won't overcome, but almost something that inherently you could never explain. How would you kind of react to those types of claims?
I would like to see the philosophical argument for why we can't solve this problem. And if that philosophical argument is persuasive enough, then it might be a good idea for me to switch careers and do something else. I don't have good evidence that this will work out. This is an unsolved problem, and it's a big problem. I think there are good reasons to think that we're pretty far away from a full solution to this, but I do see signs that we're making progress. And I have a sort of Pascal wager style argument for working on this, which is that I'm a Christian. I believe that God created life. I believe that God created the life of my children. But I also believe that God created the life of my children in a way that biology can explain a lot of those details, involving conception, gestation, birth, young human development. I, I think God is intimately involved in all that, but I also think that we do have a good scientific explanation, at least for some of the mechanisms involved with that. The same might be true for origins of life. God could have done it in a way very much like the birth of a child, which is itself an incredible miracle. It's a new consciousness in the universe. This is some sort of new qualitative thing in the universe, that very first life. And it may have been done in a way that science can explain, or it may have been done as a sort of miracle, almost like the resurrection, where no one's going to be looking at the record of the resurrection and figure out, well, how did Jesus rise from the dead in terms of how did the atoms come together? No one's going to be running sort of pre-resurrection experiments to try to get the resurrected body out of the pre-resurrected body. So the origin of life could be like either of those in the extreme, or it could be like something closer in the middle. If it turns out it can't be explained, then it is true that we are kind of wasting our time with this in that respect. But we are learning a lot of interesting things about chemistry and interesting things about biology along the way. So I wouldn't say it's entirely fruitless. But if it turns out that the origins of life can be explained and we don't look, then we'll never find the answer. So I don't see there as being as serious a cost of looking as of not looking. And so that's my kind of Pascal's wager argument for why it is worthwhile to work on this or other very large and problems of which the solution is highly uncertain.
So if we kind of were able to get to the point where we could solve it and we're able to replicate it, like all the time, creating life from non-life, you wouldn't feel like that did some sort of damage to your faith or a theological account of our origins in some sort of way? Like theology could accommodate that?
There are two important points to that. That's a great question. But there are two parts to that question, which is, first off, if you create life in a lab, even if you can do it consistently and replicate it and everything else, that's not necessarily an answer to how life originated on Earth or even anywhere else, because you did have the lab, you had the scientists in the lab, you had a lot of interference that you probably wouldn't have had. You almost certainly, except for very strange models of how life started on Earth, you don't have aliens there usually. So if life started from non-life without finite intelligent agents meddling around with it, the sort of chemistry that you need to show is chemistry that could plausibly happen without finite intelligent agents, like lab chemists being there helping the steps along the way. So that would be one important thing, is that even if you could do that consistently, have life crawling out of the lab every Thursday, that's not necessarily going to explain how life started on Earth. There's more to it than that. But even if you had something where it was completely plausible and you might have good evidence from looking at the distribution of other life in exoplanets and find out they have the same sort of conditions, and the ones that have those conditions tend to have life, you have a good Bayesian statistical argument for thinking that this is the way that life started, it would not challenge my faith in the slightest, any more than knowing something about sex ed and kind of basic biology affects the way that I see my son. I see him as a miracle. And knowing that level of science doesn't change in any way that I see him as a miracle. In fact, in some ways, it kind of enriches it, because it shows the sort of hand of God in the world, the way in which God brought this amazing thing about. And I would feel the same way about this. I would love to know how God did it.
Well, that's interesting, because a lot of Christians seem to think that sex ed does challenge their faith. So
that's a different problem.
The Paul Rimmer returns next week for sex education and you.
Goodness.
So you're talking about aliens. But mostly we've been dealing with microbes here. Now, when most Christians, if we're going to title this Alien Life with Paul Rimmer, right? How like they're going to think mostly of UFOs,
Yep.
alien life, extraterrestrials, and that's a whole different ball field, but you're not dealing with that. But I still feel like that's a loaded theological thing, that
Hmm.
if we find a microbe on Venus, we still need to account for that in some way,
Yeah.
theologically.
Hmm.
So somebody who's probably had more time to think about this than about anyone else, what do you do with that? Does this have any theological ramifications, or is it just like finding another microbe on Earth?
Um, I'm not sure how profound the theological implications are. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, um, and I should probably clarify this at the beginning. The opinions that I'm expressing are in no way the opinions of the University of Cambridge or the Leverhulme Center for the Origins of, sorry, for the Leverhulme Center of Life in the Universe. These are just my own personal thoughts. So I'm not a representative of the Leverhulme Center for Life in the Universe in this conversation in any way, but I'm going to bring it up in terms of there are theologians and arts and humanities people involved, because there probably are implications, but those are implications that, I will be honest, have not occurred to me in really any deep way. I would say that if it turns out that life is fairly prevalent in the universe, even if it's just microbial life is still amazingly complex. And if this is all over in the universe, and that says something about God's value of life and the way that God creates. But the more far-reaching implications of that would require someone with a lot more theological training than I have. One of the things you learn about when you do interdisciplinary work is you have to trust other disciplines to do the parts that you can't. Otherwise, you really don't make much progress at all.
Now, on that note, though, when I first approached you about the topic, you actually had a really interesting fact, astronomical fact,
Oh,
theological fact, I should say,
oh wow.
that in history that I had never heard about. And yeah, like if you wouldn't mind sharing that, I'd love for
Sure.
everyone else to
I would
hear
love
that.
to know what that fact is. What facts did I have that was theological that really weighed on this? I
Which
probably should know, but I will blame going through about uh, two lectures, one lab tour, and a really interesting conversation on uh, on natural selection for not being able to recall exactly what it is that you're referring to.
Don't worry, I'm going to edit this whole section out so it looks like you're answering me the moment after I say it. So don't worry about
Perfect.
all of this is
We're
going to be edited
we're
out.
professionals. We know what
We
we're
will
doing.
correct this in post. There are so many things that I've listened to where someone will say, I will correct this in post, and you know that
Yeah.
somebody missed it. But in any case,
So you brought up the fact about who was it? Was it one of the astronomers who thought that there needed to be life throughout the universe for the sake that the universe needed to glorify?
oh
Yeah.
yes, but I think that this would more bear on intelligent life. I think that there's a lot more implications for if that life is conscious and especially self-conscious. Yes, yes.
Okay.
I think that
Yeah.
that has a lot of theological implications in all sorts of interesting directions. I don't think that this works so well for the microbes, but I really liked Herschel's. So this comes from William Herschel, astronomer royal, uh, builder of great telescopes and discoverer of many beautiful nebulae, and musician. He was composer as well. And one of the things that he speculated about is it turns out, at least from his vantage, and even much more confirmed from our own vantage, that the universe is much larger than what we can observe. So there are parts of the universe that will never be able to be observed, but all of creation is supposed to be glorified to God. So there's supposed to be glory given to God for all of creation, and therefore there must be someone else giving that glory in the places of the universe that we cannot observe. And so this is a theological argument for why there has to be intelligent alien life elsewhere, life that at least is capable of appreciating the beauty of the universe and giving glory to God for it.
So if glory is given in a forest and nobody sees it, did it happen?
Yeah,
It's
it's a
kind of
yeah, well, yeah. So, I mean, that might actually be a good objection to Herschel's position in terms of it might be possible for God to be glorified without there to be a conscious agent doing the recognition of the beauty and the direct glory to God, or at least a sort of material agent. Like you could imagine angels might be everywhere, and that's not the sort of intelligent life that that astronomers are looking for.
Well, you never know. You never know what you might find out there.
If they send signals, and those signals indicate in as a sort of finite intelligence that's attempting to communicate with us, then that would be evidence of that kind of alien life. And if angels really waste their time doing that, then yes, I suppose angels could be discovered scientifically that way. I'm not sure if we'd ever know that they're truly angels, but we would at least have heard from them in that sense.
I just can't wait to hear the Hallelujah chorus like ringing out over SETI's telescopes.
Oh, I would love that to happen. I think something like that could happen if there's enough intelligent life out there. A lot of these things were recorded and they were sent out into space. And if the aliens have much better receivers than we do, they might be hearing all sorts of beautiful music from us, and they might beam some of it back to just let us know that they either liked it or didn't.
So if you were a bit hesitant to theologically speculate about, cells or something like that, but you are a bit more excited to theologically speculate about intelligent life, how can I spur you to do said speculation? Like if intelligent life was discovered on another planet, how do you think that might impact Christianity or global religion? Like how's that going to change the way we see things?
I might have some sort of questions like that kind of I've heard from early Mormons, probably even Mormons now, with the discovery of the New World and how you try to reconcile that with Christ's message. Are these people who also are saved the same way? Well, in a sense, Mormons have this amazing tale of Christ appearing to the Native Americans, which is a sort of lost tribe of Israel or something, in the New World. This raises paralandria kind of questions for C.S. Lewis fans. The sort of Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandria series is an incredible series, asking the question of did all intelligent life experience a fall? And if it did, does it need Jesus as a savior, or is there some other salvific pathway for other intelligent life? Those are some of the first questions that I would have. And I don't think that I think I lost you all.
I turned off video because we're having some reception problems. You can go ahead and pick up.
Oh, okay. So yeah, the thing that I would mention is I don't think that I'm unique in thinking about that. I don't even think C.S. Lewis was unique in thinking about that. There's this amazing story by this Eastern European writer about robots. I would have to look up the specifics. Maybe we could edit that into, but the specifics of that particular story is where the word robot was first coined. And one of the things that they were wondering is if you built this artificial intelligence, would you need to evangelize it? There were evangelists that were trying to convince the robots to let Jesus into their hearts. And so I do think that there would be a lot of interesting questions that would be raised by the discovery of intelligent alien life about how the whole salvation story works. I suspect it would be solved in a way of geography, very much like I think mainstream Christianity deals with the discovery of the New World, in that Christ is still an important part of the salvation of the entire cosmos. But the specifics of that may play out differently for different cultures in different places in the universe.
Yeah, but then that opens up the question of, so a Martian comes to you, lands at your door, Paul, and says, "Ah, yes, you are the planet where God became incarnate. Baptize me." Would you baptize the Martian? Would you take him down to the creek and have a good old-fashioned baptism? And
Personally, no. I'd probably consult my priest. But maybe the priest should baptize him. I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the theological implications of that are profound, and really do need need to be sorted out. I think that there is important material there that really needs to be worked through while we're thinking about the potential discovery of intelligent alien life. Something that I have no idea if it's very likely or not. We haven't found any yet, and there's all kinds of interesting things with that involving what's called the Fermi paradox. Why don't we see more alien life? If life is easy enough to start and intelligent life isn't that much of a barrier, why don't we see it in more places? But if we do discover it tomorrow, it would be nice to have some of these details worked out. And I think even if it's only a hypothetical, I think there's a lot of useful theology and philosophy that can be done with hypotheticals and counterfactuals. And so just thinking about this, I think, can be very enriching to our faith, even if it turns out that we're the only intelligent life in the observable universe.
I'm going to turn the video back on real quick. So it does seem then that it's somewhat of a pressing question, because it does seem like for the first time that we can actually, any day now, wake up and discover, hey, look, Paul Rimmer has discovered the first strain of the first Andromeda strain in the clouds of Jupiter. So it seems like it's much more of a pressing issue than before, that we actually can't just think about this in a sort of abstract way. We actually have to come up with some real answers for the church. Is that sort of what?
I think for intelligent life, certainly. I think probably for microbial life as well, but I just think that there's been less thought in that direction for life that, to use language of Aristotle, doesn't have a rational soul. I think that the implications are different, but I think they're probably there, and they're just understudied. And it would be great to see how those are developed. I do think there are some direct implications for people of certain philosophical persuasions. If you're persuaded toward the sort of intelligent design movement, which I'm certainly not, but if you are persuaded toward that kind of intelligent design approach, then you might or might not be challenged by the presence of life that had its own origins elsewhere. You can, of course, say, well, that also is a miracle, but you could always say that. If it turns out to be prevalent enough, then I think that either the concept of miracle would need to be refined in a way that might challenge intelligent design a bit, or it might just turn out that intelligent agents are a lot more active than certain ID theorists would hypothesize. But I do think that there could be some implications there. And I think there would be even more implications for certain sorts of young Earth creationists who might think that, Genesis certainly didn't talk about life starting on Venus. And if it's really important that Genesis talks about what happened, that would be a genuine challenge. I suspect that they could also get out of that in the way that they get out of a lot of things by simply either denying or radically reinterpreting the data. They would just deny that the life was there. But those are manifest implications that are connected to a lot of people's faiths and a lot of people's philosophical positions. I think that there are broader implications, but like I said, I don't think a lot of those implications have been worked out, and certainly not very much by myself.
So if you could advise something to Christians and maybe to the church, as somebody who's working in this actively, what would you like to see 5 years down the road? The Leverhulme Center has become a roaring success. What has it achieved?
I would say that the center would be a success if it better constrains what sort of chemistry you would expect to find in different environments where different kinds of origin scenarios would have happened, and that can lay the groundwork for something that would take a lot longer than even the next 5 or 10 years, but is potentially achievable in the next 20 or 30 if life is common enough. The distribution of that life will tell you something about its origins. It'll be conflated with a whole bunch of other things. But one of the things that the Leverhulme Center and other groups active around the world can do is provide a context so that once we have that data, we'll be able to connect it to particular origins scenarios. I also think there's a potential for the center to make further breakthroughs in the direction of origins. One of the researchers in the center is working very much on the origin of the genetic code, and I think there is a decent chance that he'll make some fairly profound breakthroughs in that direction in the next 5 to 10 years. And those are small steps. A genetic code is not life. I think that we're a long way away from that, but these are steps in that sort of direction. This is just another stepping stone. Science is about these kinds of small stepping stones. The advice I would give to Christians is to keep an open mind about what science can show, and try to make sure that your faith isn't contingent on or isn't hanging on some sort of contingent aspect of science. So if your faith hangs on life being rare, and you find out that life is everywhere, then you're going to be losing this really profound and very profoundly true part of your own identity. You're going to be losing this relationship over something that I really don't think is very strongly connected at all to one's own faith. I think connecting one's faith to anything scientific, which is by its nature uncertain, is a recipe for disaster. I do think that there might be some needed modifications in one's own theology and Christian vision, but the sort of core faith, I think there's no reason for that not to remain. And some of those modifications might just be that you'll have to think about different ways in which God interacts with the world, different ways in which the creative process of God plays out. If it does turn out that there's a good scientific explanation for how life originated, and that's borne out in the data of life that we find elsewhere in the universe, then that might change the way that you think about how God interacts with the world. But I don't think it should change anything about thinking that God does interact with the world, and certainly not that God loves us and sent his son to die for us.
Yeah, I mean, even if you do want to stick with a very traditional design argument, it's very easy to pivot from saying that God directly created, life, to God created a universe that was capable of bringing about life. It's not a giant theological leap to make that move.
Yeah. I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that one of my problems with those sorts of design arguments, both the one of kind of setting it up so that it can just happen, or directly interfering, is that both of them seem to have a very deistic kind of notion of God. One who just kind of lets things play out, does absolutely nothing until some kind of key critical moment, maybe, where God kind of just fiddles a little bit, does one little thing, creates the ribosome, whatever, and then just steps back again. That kind of tinkerer God, I think, makes a lot of sense if you imagine that the universe is like a watch or a clock or something like that needs to be wound every now and again. But I don't think that it fits very well with a robust and traditional Christian conception of the divine.
It kind of reminds me of the debates in Newton's time, because Newton had these beautiful laws of gravity, and he said, look at how this bespeaks the glory of God. And then he noticed, eventually over time, small perturbations, gravitational perturbations will throw it off. So God's got to come in and fix the order. Look at how that shows the glory of God. So it was both the perfection and the imperfection of the system that both bespoke the glory of God. And ever since then, we've been wrestling. Is it the perfect system that can operate, that and create order on its own, or is it the system where God has to go in and actually create the order himself?
Yes.
Which one is our natural theology?
And since both, I think, are in fact good evidence of God's involvement, I think this fits very well with the beginning of the Nicene Creed, that God is a creator of all things visible and invisible. If you try to come up with some way of detecting and distinguishing what has been created by God and what hasn't, then either that test is going to turn out that everything was, or the test, at least from this a priori theological position that I have, is wrong in the places where it finds out that things weren't created by God. And so in that sense, I think from a scientific perspective, the test becomes a little bit meaningless, or it just becomes wrong. Like, is this a bad test? It's a bad test or a meaningless test. And so, I just don't really truck with that.
I just want to say, you quoted C.S. Lewis earlier, and if he's okay with aliens, we have to be. He's like the Third Testament. So game over.
Well, yeah, no, it's for for good, faithful American evangelicals. One of the
I was a
one
tour
of the
guide
great
at
evangelists. Yeah.
I was a tour guide at his house. I was a tour guide at his house for
Oh,
a few
fun.
months. The entire time I was there, I maybe had a couple hundred people go through. I think probably like 95% were Americans.
I could believe that. It's I mean I have a friend who went to a small Christian university in Texas, and they had an entire class on C.S. Lewis, and it was a very conservative Christian university, and they commented on how the teacher would kind of elide over some of Lewis's more universalist leanings, and certainly his thoughts um, about aliens and other intelligent life and this sort of thing. And I mean, Lewis certainly had some non-standard thoughts for your typical conservative evangelical Christian, even though a lot of his sort of mere Christianity level writings fit in very well.
We're actually hoping to do a podcast specifically on the unorthodox thoughts of C.S. Lewis at some point. So
Great.
that's planned. That's
Wonderful.
on the schedule.
Yes. The doors to hell are always locked from the inside. So, yes.
Let me continue this profound theological discussion with another very serious
This is why you
question.
don't get scientists to talk theology.
There are favorites because the theologians are always so restrained, where the scientists are like, "Nah, let's just say it. I'm not an expert in this field, so I can say what I want."
I don't know what I'm talking
My
about.
reputation's not on the line.
Yeah. Well, here's a question that might put your reputation on the line. Obviously, the search for extraterrestrial life is much more respectable and scientific than just, UFO sightings and Area 51. But do you think there is anything at all behind this mass wave of UFO sightings over the last century or so? Is there any event or sighting out of all that mess that you think might be interesting enough to merit serious consideration?
So I don't study these things, so I don't know. I've found some things that I wouldn't be able to explain myself, that then I found out later somebody else was able to explain plausibly. I would suspect that there are a handful of these for which we don't have a good explanation, but that's true of almost everything. It's dangerous to say that I don't have a good explanation for something, therefore this particular conclusion, aliens, God, whatever. Arguments from ignorance can be very dangerous the more specific they get. If it's a pure argument from ignorance, it might be fair to say, oh, maybe there's a new phenomena. I remember a friend of mine talking about an experience that he had with ball lightning, which almost seemed spiritual, this great light that was kind of following him around. Ball lightning is a very strange phenomena that is not well understood. There are a lot of plasma physicists studying it. It has very strange behaviors. We don't understand everything about it. It doesn't involve any sort of intelligence, at least no sort of finite alien intelligence. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these don't have good explanations, but I wouldn't draw many conclusions from that. It just looks so different from the way that I would imagine it. I try to imagine the way the world would look if intelligent aliens were visiting us. And unless they happen to be kind of sloppy experimentalists who are setting up a really bad zoo and they keep kind of interfering with their experimental subjects by accident, or if they're very good experimentalists and they want to see how we'll react to various stimuli, I suppose those things are possible. But it just seems very strange to me that an intelligence would act that way. Maybe it's a strange intelligence, right? But it seems a lot more likely to me that if there was an intelligence that really wanted to communicate with us, it would communicate with us on a much broader, more exploratory kind of way that all of us pretty quickly would become aware of, or that none of us would become aware of because we just didn't understand the signal at all. Like we see a sort of radio signal, we weren't quite able to make sense of it. It was some obvious mathematical function for these aliens, but it wasn't so obvious for us. Those sorts of things that are either easily missed or things that we would easily recognize and that would be persuasive at least to the scientists and the politicians, and eventually to the general public. These kinds of weird sightings of lights and various other things that are often almost like religious experiences are very, very odd for if some other organism were trying to make contact with us as a civilization. It just doesn't it's hard for me to make sense of it. It doesn't mean it's not true. I think there are some other statistical arguments for saying that traveling that great a distance and having engine problems in our atmosphere seems a little strange. If you had the technology to do that, why are you having these kinds of problems there? But again, I don't know a lot about these phenomena. I don't take them seriously, but I don't take them unseriously. I don't know.
Well, they're not traveling great distances. They've been buried down in the earth for 10,000 years since they built the pyramids. And now they're coming back up to the surface for the first. So they haven't had.
So I just want to point out this whole question was John's idea. So don't blame me. Don't blame me for whenever you got asked about UFOs.
One of these days, I'm going to ask that question, and some scientist is going to ruin his whole reputation by just being like, yes, it's all true. I was there.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to pick up on the bald lightning and the spiritual experience with a bald lightning. Now, that's an amazing story by itself. If I got followed by a giant glowing orb, I might be tempted to spiritualize that moment, especially because I already have the vocabulary and the worldview to interpret it that way.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not exactly on topic though, but I do want to ask, like, what license do you think, if something like this were to happen to you, where does your scientist brain come in? And where does your Christian brain come in? And how do you fit the two for something as unusual like that?
Well, very good question. When it's not my own experience, I have a lot of trouble dealing with it in any way. I need to respect the own subjective experience of the person, while at the same time being reasonably skeptical about context and how much this makes sense to me. But it's remote. So I have had my own spiritual experiences, which largely I just kind of know internally that there is this spiritual component. It's very difficult for me to explain. I almost sometimes describe it as God reaching into my mind and adjusting my beliefs, because that's just the way that I would have to understand it. These sometimes go along with standing on top of a mountain in one case and looking at the stars and being overwhelmed by this experience and this presence, and already having a sort of Christian language to understand that. But I think that something more profound is also happening with me interiorly. At the same time, I've also had these, and they run in the family, these sorts of experiences of waking up and being paralyzed, and having creatures sitting on my chest, staring at me. This is something other family members of mine have gone through, and this is something I go through. And there are some people I found out recently who do connect these with spiritual events, and I don't at all. These seem to have very regular sort of neurological explanations. And distinguishing between those two, I don't think can be done empirically, and certainly not in a reductionist way. I can't point out that it's because the alien or not really the alien, but the demon or whatever it is says something that I know that it's just in my head. It's not like I can pick out one component of any of these experiences to say, this proves that this was a legitimate religious experience. This proves that it wasn't. There's always a bit of uncertainty there. It's more a holistic aspect of that. And some aspect of that I don't think can even be articulated. I think that there are some things that are true that cannot be expressed, these non-propositional truths. And in my case, with the two profound religious experiences that I have had, there is a lot of non-propositional content to them. There's non-propositional aspects to them that I find much more convincing than anything that I could say about them. When I talk about them, they almost sound sometimes a little lame, almost like Collins, What's his first name? I can't believe I'm blanking.
Francis
on it.
Collins?
Yeah, Francis Collins talking about the three streams.
The three streams in the waterfall. Yeah.
Yes, it sounds lame.
It's the Trinity.
Yes, but that misses all of the most important stuff because it's written out. It misses what it is like to be there. It's just like when someone's describing, in a date with someone that they genuinely love. Oftentimes, if it's just written out, a lot of things are missed, especially by someone who's never experienced that kind of romantic love before. They can read that and it can seem fairly inconsequential, but that's because the most important things are the things that can't be uttered.
Well, that was a profound line to end on. I love that. So if I were to sort of get it back to the main topic, if I were to, I love the tangent because that was beautiful. That was gold.
That was a beautiful line to end on. We're not going to end on it, but it would have been beautiful.
I'll edit it and put it at the end. No,
you can do whatever you want. Just yeah.
So, getting back to the main point, I wanted to bring up just one final sort of summation that I think kind of encapsulates what you're. I wanted to bring up one final summation of what I think your overall point is, which is number one, if there is intelligent life out there, or if there is any life at all, we're in no place right now to know when we'll discover that. It could be tomorrow, it could be 100 years from now, it could never happen.
Yeah.
But number two, this isn't a threat for the church. And number three, we need to have the theological resources to be able to deal with that if that did actually happen tomorrow.
Yeah. I think all three of those are absolutely correct. And I think 2 and 3 are connected because I do think that if the church, both in terms of its theological development and its communication more widely to the faithful, isn't well developed, then this is more likely to cause unneeded theological, psychological, emotional, spiritual distress if this did happen, than if we already have a healthy framework to deal with it.
Awesome. Any final thoughts before we end this discussion?
Really enjoyed the conversation. This was a lot of fun and very wide-ranging. God, aliens, UFOs, all sorts of interesting
Bald
things.
lightning.
Not the typical sorts of discussions that I get to have outside of having good drinks with friends at a pub, to be honest. But it was really, really enjoyable, and I'm very grateful that you brought me on to have this conversation.
That's why we do it. Thank you so much, Dr. Rimmer.
Yeah, thank you very much.